Hey, Andy, can you hear me? It's Nancy. Hey, Andy, it's Nancy. Can you hear me?
You mean?
Hey, Colin, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, yeah.
Oh, thank God, I'm having computer problems. Thank you so much for verifying.
The least I can do. In that note, then I'm going to leave early. I've done my job for the day.
You have done your job. Thank you. My laptop crashed. My work laptop crashed. So I'm on my home one, and it's like, okay. Anyway, it's all good.
And Chris, I apologize. I am going to have to scoot out at about 6:30 for another meeting that I have. I'm hoping to join up a little bit later, but apologize for bailing out on you. And everybody else.
Brian was having audio issues, so he's logging out and logging back in.
Yeah, did it come through now? Is it back yet? No?
Brian's?
I'm here. Did you say Brian or Ryan had issues?
Brian Isa.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Hey Nancy, it's Matt.
Hey, Matt, how are you?
Oh, I'm good. I caught a little bit of the corona here, so I'm probably going to
Oh,
stay a little bit incognito this evening.
I'm sorry to hear that.
I think I'm on the downhill side of it, so I guess to recovery. So doing better than I was yesterday.
Oh,
Good.
that's good.
Good.
Okay, so I've asked everybody to unmute, so then I'm gonna mute you except for Chris Brewster. And Chris, Brian must be still having trouble. So if you and Matt want to get started, whatever you'd like to do.
Okay. Yeah, I will. And then if we need to backtrack or Brian wants to hit anything when he joins, he can just
Yeah,
chime in. Let me share my screen here. Does everyone have the title slide?
I
Okay.
can see it. Yeah.
All right. So tonight, hopefully you've had a chance to look at some of the drafts, but by all means, don't feel like you have to have a command of it. Tonight's kind of to introduce and get to any discussion of the topics you want as deep as we need to and as shallow as you want to. Just a reminder, these are kind of initial drafts, working drafts. So there, I think you saw some of the notes to ourselves that we're working on, but it is at least a good touch point with you all to see if we're on track with the direction you want to take this. So if you remember, the left side is how we're organizing the overall code. So that can orient you to what's coming. And one of the documents we sent tried to give a summary of all of those chapters and how they relate to your current standards and current codes. And the right side is what we've been working on with the technical committee as a follow-up with our discussions with you all that went into these drafts. I will put one caveat that everything we've discussed with the technical committee hasn't quite been incorporated in every instance of these drafts. I think maybe tonight's has, but there will certainly be some coming up where we have some issues to still run down before we would finalize things to make a recommendation. But again, tonight we're hitting the procedures and technical provisions that the committee addressed in their first meeting. And then we'll get into some of the public realm design things that the committee hit in the second meeting, absent landscape. So chapter 8 is coming. It's the very next one that's coming to you. So there's a puzzle piece that goes in with the landscape design into all of these, but we'll hit the community design and subdivision standards in chapter 3. And then access and parking in chapter 7.
Hey, Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Nancy. I forgot to do public comment, and we do have a couple of people. I do apologize. It's been
Okay, great. I'll pause here.
little discombobulated evening.
That's fine.
So, Matt McBride.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, so I'm going to set the timer and you can address the committee for 3 minutes. And just as a reminder, the committee cannot engage in any dialogue. If you have any questions that you'd like answered, feel free to email Brian Isom.
Perfect.
So go for it, sir.
All right. Well, I'm here today to talk about parking, and actually a little different than what you probably hear. I'm here to talk about the reduction of parking, and hopefully that this is part of the new code. As an owner in Inglewood and a developer builder, we all know we have an affordability crisis on our hand when it comes to housing. And the cost of structured parking we're finding right now is exceeding $30,000 a space. And at the end of the day, you know, unfortunately, those costs get passed on to the residents because deals have to pencil. We just can't burden all the costs. Additionally, we aren't really paying taxes on these parking spaces. You know, we pay taxes on either units or square footage commercial space. So every square foot of parking that could be another use is tax revenue that the city isn't necessarily seeing for their transportation improvements and all the other tax benefits. We also aren't using all the parking we build. We find this in all of our communities. We have about 6 or 7 communities around the Denver metro area, but even RTD published a study recently that said only 60% of market rate apartments are fully utilizing their parking in the Denver metro area. And then cars are really expensive. You know, back to the affordability crisis, it's costing the average owner in Denver just about under $6,000 a year to own a car. So the more opportunities we can provide multimodal transportation for these for our residents, the better it will be for everybody. And hopefully that means there'll be more money to spend at our local businesses. And then there's the whole sustainability side of it. We know cars are bad for the environment, even if there's electric, you know, they have different pros and cons, or gas, you know, they're probably even worse. But, you know, the fewer cars we have in our parking lots and on the roads are a good thing, and really trying to encourage multimodal transportation, parking, and street design. Implementing these in the code encourages means of sustainable transportation. And, you know, at the end of the day, you know, excessive parking is only feeding our congestion problem in our cities in the Denver metro area, and not necessarily reducing the problem, just kind of kicking the can on the problem. And, you know, other cities such as Denver have started instituting a maximum. While we understand Englewood is not as urban as Denver, and we have no visions of Englewood getting to a maximum parking anytime soon versus a minimum parking. There are cities that are taking drastic steps to reduce the parking, and you know, we hope Englewood takes the opportunity in the new code rewrite to lessen the parking demand for the community, so that we can find better ways to get around. That's it.
Thank you very much. I have a Tucker Bennett. Did you wish to speak to the committee? You'd have to unmute. Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
just listening in, so thank
Okay.
you.
You're welcome. All right. Thank you both very much for your patience. Chris, thank you so much. It's back to you.
Okay, thank you. So moving into the substance of the articles, the first two again are the procedures, so they're a little bit dry, but I didn't want to skip anything that you might have questions, and also wanted to give you some of the highlights. So chapter 1, we're putting all the general provisions, technical, legal prerequisites, some of those things, and essentially marrying over most of the same things from your code. So the key changes really to reorganize and simplify some things. We've clarified language with a plain language approach. In other words, try to say it more simply, but have the same legal and policy effect. Coordinating with other technical sections, so trying to put all of them in one place so that these parts of the code sit kind of absent the substance of how we impact development. Updated the purpose section to connect more directly with the more recent plans and policies. Not that they weren't doing that before, but they were more kind of taking the typical planning statutory language of public health, safety, and welfare. So we went a little further and made the purposes connect more to your broad planning goals. And at this point, we're also trying to set up a hierarchy of guiding language that you'll start to see throughout the other sections of the code. So the purposes are broad and general, connecting to your comprehensive plan and big policies. Intent statements are going to get a little more specific to districts or certain topics, and they're going to be application oriented. In other words, how does this implement some of those policies? And then design objectives is when we get very specific and we're talking about outcomes. And so those will be the 3 things that guide flexibility. And we'll talk about that more, but just wanted to hit that point a little more strongly than some of the other ones. Emphasize and coordinate the interpretation elements they're in your current code now, but we put a few of them all in the same place to say, these are the kind of things where we want to just say them once, so we don't have to keep repeating them throughout the code. You know, things like when you have a long list saying including but not limited to, we just put a clause in there that says whenever we put a list, it always means that it could include other things unless it was a definitive list. So there's things like that, just rules of construction that we don't want to keep saying over and over, that helps us write a little more plainly throughout the code. The last one is one where there is something to be aware of, a few things, the expanded non-conformity consideration. So non-conforming lots, right now, you have a process to go through to be able to use one of those. So we're playing with the idea of making that an administrative approval, much like the other non-conforming situations. And that is, whenever you encounter one and you prove that you are legally non-conforming, in other words, it was legally established prior to the code, you should have certain development rights that go along with that, rather than currently the non-conforming lots need a planning commission approval prior to developing. We think, and I think staff could probably correct me, that tracing the breadcrumbs, that was related to the smaller urban lots that were pre-existing, but now don't meet the zoning district standards. Since we're exploring allowing some of those, at least in limited conditions or different situations, we didn't think it was necessary for those to go through a non-conforming review, since in some districts they will be allowed, not only the existing ones, but to be able to create them anew under certain conditions. The other element is, we heard from in a past steering committee meeting, actually in some of the public sessions, we heard about some situations with non-conforming uses or buildings where we would like some limited exceptions to possibly expand or reinvest in those, particularly when that reinvestment or expansion is less than what could otherwise be built under the zoning district standards. And so we've put some criteria in to consider that. When we went to do that, we noticed there already were some provisions in your code to allow some limited expansions of non-conformances. So we tried to put those all in the same place through a specific process. Those incidentally would trigger a review, because it is going kind of beyond what staff would administratively typically do. And then the last part is, there's currently a process for certifying non-conforming situations, and we're exploring whether we want to be doing that and tracking them for yearly updates, or whether it should just be done on a more ad hoc basis. That is, in other words, whenever any particular owner or property interest has a non-conforming situation, if they're able to prove and establish that it was legally created, that they could use that, and it wouldn't be something that you could certainly certify it if you wanted to forever answer that question and have a paper that showed that, but you wouldn't necessarily lose it if you didn't certify it. And then also the administrative issues with staff of having to renew those annually, we're exploring whether that's necessary or not. So
Hey,
those
Chris,
are, yes.
I'm sorry. We have a question. Do you
Okay.
want to take it now?
Yeah,
or-
I had wound up with chapter 1, so I'll just pause for questions right there.
Okay, Colin?
Thank you. Is that referring to like the used car lots on Broadway, where every year they have to come through and do like a reconformance or something that's a burden to the staff at that point?
Yeah, it is referring to the situations like that. I don't know. I think staff kind of in our technical committee meetings anyway was like, it's really not a huge burden, although some maybe thought it was. The other issue with that is there was at least some thoughts that was sort of hoping that, you know, that use it or lose it type situation, where if you didn't recertify, all of a sudden you lose that use. So we're wondering if that's the right strategy, or if there are uses that you want to phase out over time. There's different ways to do that than kind of have sort of a gotcha on the non-conformance situation. So that's kind of the bigger picture. But yeah, the circumstance you described would be an example of that. Any other questions on chapter 1?
I'm not seeing any hands. I think you're good.
Okay. All right, chapter 2, this is all of the procedures. So we, one of the things on chapter 1 that you saw in there, we took all of the administrative review bodies that review applications or make decisions on the code. We moved them to chapter 1 because it's more of an operating system type thing, or you know, the mechanics of the code. So this chapter could focus just on applications, things where a property owner wants to do something, they need to have a staff or public review of that application. So the biggest change was just in organization. So we put all of the procedures that you may encounter in one section, and it's just general to all. So that's another technique to say we just want to say these things once and not repeat similar things that might apply to multiple applications and have the same types of provisions repeating over and over again. And then we use the table to apply those different elements, even though they might not all apply to each application. The table then kind of checks boxes on which ones should apply. And then that also enables us to write each of the different applications a little more simply under that common structure of applicability, what triggers that application, the criteria, how we're going to review it, how both staff in staff reports, or if they're not the decision-making body, planning commission and council will review it. So that gives expectations to both the applicant and the decision makers. Then any specific procedures, things that might be unique to that particular application are listed, or things that help elaborate on what the table or general section says. And then lastly, the effective decision. What happens when a decision is made? Is there an appeal? If so, how? Do you go straight to permit? Is there another step? So that common structure helps kind of orient people to how the processes are supposed to work. We also eliminated and consolidated some administrative processes. So things that were in there that weren't really, the code didn't really change how or what was to be done. And it may have actually constrained what different departments to do under their administrative review. So some of the things that were more permit oriented, we removed out of there. Some of them appear in the current table, but then don't have any procedures listed with them. And so what we did was we consolidated a lot of them under the site improvement plan process. It's sort of general to all of these things. So that first level of bullet points, limited review uses, which are just a staff review, temporary uses, which are just a staff review, or unlisted uses, which are just a staff review. All of those could either go through just a general interpretation by staff, or they could go through with the site improvement plan and use that process. So we didn't need to create separate processes for them. And then similarly, what I mentioned about the non-conforming structure and non-conforming lots, that would go under the same process as well if we didn't have to send that to planning commission. Some of the processes we felt were inapplicable. So annexations being one, you're a landlocked community and it's not likely that you'd be annexing property. In the event that you do, for an unusual circumstance or situation, we often like to take those provisions out of the code anyway, because you need to follow state statutes, and we don't necessarily need to be repeating state statutes in the development code if you need to follow them anyway. So our thought was that's an easy one to get out and kind of trim the code down a little bit. Comprehensive plans amendments we eliminated for a slightly different reason. We view those as existing sort of independent of the code, above and beyond. And similarly, you have state statute provisions you have to do to amend the comprehensive plan. But it seemed a little backwards to have the document guiding the code, then have a process to change that document in the code itself. So we're, at least in this draft, suggesting to remove that. Appeals processes. So there's a number of different things of how an application could be appealed. And so we're trying to clarify that. The first level is expanding on administrative adjustment options, those things that staff can make a decision on where something doesn't technically meet the code. Not really an appeal, but a decision process. Then we have two different paths. The Board of Adjustments right to, or actually authority to review appeals when there's a decision made under the code by staff. So interpretations, things that they're applying a standard and someone disagrees with how they're applying it, those by statute can go to the Board of Adjustments. Some of your current procedures go to the Board of Adjustments as well. But what we're suggesting in this draft is that anything that gets into the application process where there's an actual application that's appealed up through, that's going through either staff, planning commission, and city council review body, that all of those should kind of have the next level appeal. So in other words, if it's a staff decision on a site plan, it could be appealed to the planning commission. If it's a planning commission a decision on a conditional use permit, it could be appealed to the city council. And that's the way your code is set up now for the most part, but there are a couple of them where we're switching back to that process. Last 2 points, and I'll pause for questions. We're monitoring the Historic Preservation Commission. Obviously, they're included in there as a body. Some of the applications that we took out of the process right now had to deal with certain historic things, historic designation of property and historic landmark signs are in their table. So we figure we're going to catch all those in chapter 12 and put a specific process in. And to the extent we need to coordinate that with chapter 2, we'll do that at that time. And then we have placeholders for the approach to PUDs. And then there's a section that was recently amended into the code for specific plans, really large scale plans that can help amend development standards. And so we weren't at a point where we had that resolved, but and that's from our standpoint and conversations with staff members over the last 2 or 3 weeks, we have a solid approach to those that are in a working draft stage, but there's currently just placeholders in chapter 2 right now for those. So any questions on the procedures part of it?
I'm not seeing any hands.
All
I
right.
got a little something, Chris. I don't know if I can say something because I'm staff,
No, go ahead.
but I'm kind of getting to know things too, so maybe it's good for others. If you don't know, my name is Ryan. I'm a new planner here, City of Inglewood in the Community Development Department. I'm wondering if there are state level statute enabling authority statutes that pertain to the planning commission, because that's where they like juridically derive their authority from, that bake into the cake, if you will, certain processes or certain requirements and thresholds or whatever that are too obscure for me to like think of off the top of my head. And because that's such an obscure question, that's why I'm asking it. Yeah.
No, I kind of got the flavor for it. You're right. There are, and I don't think any of the two-part answer to that question. Yes, there are. There's certain things that the planning commission is specifically given authority to do. They're usually almost always in an advisory role, but then allow your city council to delegate the decision to them. So things that are like the comprehensive plan is a good example. A lot of statutes say the planning commission adopts that. Well, a lot of cities then go on and have their city council adopt it because they want to signify that they're on the same page with that. But technically, there's decisions like that lie with the planning commission. The other part of your answer is that your code is very clear in establishing right up front that you're exercising your home rule authority. So to the extent that anything in here conflicts with the statutes, you could use your home rule authority to give the planning commission certain powers or not. But we've kind of been tracking those, and I don't think there's anything that's running too astray of a typical process in that regard. But again, as you get more ideas and get some thoughts on that, we'd be happy to entertain them and take a look at it, because it's actually one of the things we really like emphasizing and stressing is that checks and balances between planning commission and city council, because it's a good and healthy thing and good way to make decisions.
There are like trigger pulls that, if you will, like, I mean, once you have planning commission, you shall do certain things. And if there's, if not every citizen might appreciate, or even every planner or civil servant or planning commissioner that says, once you do this sort of thing, the state expects you to keep up on it. And there's regular reports or staff requirements, you're obliging yourself to certain work or something like that. Anyway.
Andy?
Was there any discussion about some of the criteria for some of these processes and reworking or improving any of those?
Not in depth. And so we tried to go through each of the criteria and keep them. We didn't hear any problems with or concerns of any of the criteria specifically. So what we went through and did was we tried to marry over the ones where you had lots of criteria or good criteria, or we tried to simplify ones where it was kind of circular or could have been said more plainly, or more importantly, we wanted to connect it to the new way this code was going to be addressing that topic. And then there were others where we just kind of took our own liberties and tried to embellish on some criteria that we thought were important. So the criteria, that's how the criteria that you see in there were arrived at. There hasn't been a lot of discussion on either your previous ones or the current ones.
Yeah, thanks. I think with the new purpose and intent language, there could be some better connections. I know the Board of Appeals and Adjustments, we struggle sometimes with some of those references. So yeah, I might have some feedback.
Great. Good question. Any others?
Nope, I think you're good.
All right, now we're getting into some of the, oh, I'm sorry, I should have skipped to this. This was our summary table, but I think we covered most of these, but just an example of how we're trying to at least give people a first blush of what they might be running into on some of the applications and what's entailed in each process, who makes the decision and those types of things. This has been updated slightly from the one that was in your draft based on some of those recent discussions I was talking about. This is also probably the transition here is a good time to talk about this slide. This was one that we showed in our kickoff presentation that, you know, we're always faced with the challenge of adding flexibility to the code, but also adding certainty, and how do those things not be what seems to be opposite goals. So the top approach is how we like to characterize the way planners have used to do regulations and zoning, and to some extent still do in cases, but when we take a more design-based approach like your plan suggests and like your code audit suggested, it enables us to look at things in shades of gray. And are we doing that while still raising expectations? So based on that last comment, you know, some of the intent and design objectives really need to guide how we come out on the opposite end of that. So a few, the right side of the screen is that kind of tied to this code. So the standards are there in the middle. We want those to be as objective and as measurable as we possibly can make them, even when we're talking about subjects that we know are slightly subjective, particularly on the design side. So how we apply that and evaluate that is guided by the first two. What was the intent? What was the design objective? And are we applying this standard in a way that achieves that? The second one is also something that this committee talked about, is we might want to refine how a standard applies based on where it's applying. So context-based standards, the streets is a good example of that. And when we get into some of the development standards on commercial and residential, the streets will be that context that guides whether you should do one thing or the other. So even when we're applying the same standards, those three things leading in can help us. And then on the backside is where the flexibility comes in. Listing design strategy or different techniques or options on how to meet that standard. And then at the last level, there's some subjective or discretionary ability to grant relief when something could equally or better meet that design objective, but it doesn't meet the standards. So that's the kind of approach we're taking, and it's relevant to tonight's drafts. If you haven't looked at it, I'll redirect you after this meeting. 16.2.10 is the process to do that. You currently have an administrative adjustments process. So we are simply leveraging that and trying to make that more applicable to things coming up, and actually refine how decisions are made within that process and not have it be as subjective. And then these three substantive standards all refer to that process as well, and kind of give some meat, so to speak, to feed into that process. So moving on to 3, this is in the previous code, basically subdivision regulations. You guys don't do a lot of large scale platting of property since you're built out and highly connected and already divided city property wise. So we began to recharacterize this as, and we think of subdivision regulations this way anyway, community and subdivision design standards. So those things that were in your code that were at a scale larger than a project. And there were a lot of things, particularly in the access and circulation, all those really good goals about transit connectivity, pedestrian connectivity, bike connectivity that were listed as a site design element. Putting them in here helped us to kind of elevate them to a larger than site design type analysis, but they can connect to individual projects as well. And then to the extent you are doing larger scale redevelopment projects, obviously these things all kick in. So again, really reorganizing and identifying those large scale topics, the 4 main topics: street and block patterns, street design, open and civic spaces, and then required improvements, infrastructure, things that serve more than one property, or when they go in will impact more than one property. And then really emphasizing taking out the things that are more either redundant of your engineering and construction specifications or things that should completely defer to that. We didn't want to create a conflict between these. So we're in the process of figuring out whether we've done that correctly with all of them, but we certainly want this chapter to coordinate with the city's design and construction standards and specifications most closely.
Judy, did you have a question?
Yeah, just on the open space. So we often have discussions regarding open space requirements when we're doing a PUD. So will all of those expectations be here, or are they going to be, this is what, is it going to be you must follow and we're going to refer back to this for PUDs, or is that just going to be a general for these larger projects that you're referring to?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this provision, if you look to the applicability of when these apply, these technically apply anytime someone's platting property. So it could be a smaller scale project, but it would more likely to be a larger scale or a PUD, as you mentioned. And so regarding open space, what that will mean is there'll be, if we hold the PUD question for a moment, what that's going to do is it's going to trigger your current open space standard, which you have a dedication requirement, and then you have a fee in lieu option. And our assumption, and I think the technical committee's feedback was, yes, that's, and our question was, it seems unusual for a community that's built out and isn't dedicating a lot of open space. Is that still in use? And the answer was, yes, it is. It's almost always the fee in lieu option though, however. So there's their first requirement, that there is a public space requirement when they plat property. The second thing is, I think is more what your question is getting at, is how do we now coordinate some of the, either the spaces that won't be public or the things that are more project or site specific open spaces. And so there's a section in the open space provisions that's attempting to do that. Whether how much is required or not is going to be in our development standards tables that are coming up in chapters 5 and 6. So there will be a lot or project-based open space requirement. And this, what this section is trying to do is to say, if at a larger block scale or project scale, you have any of these types of private or common spaces, they can contribute to your open space requirement. Now, the third part of your question, what do you do with PUDs? PUDs will have the liberty to propose different things and let you guys approve things that don't technically meet the code. What we're hoping is that these base standards are the starting point, and then you can find out whether you need to tweak or amend them. Because one of the ideas throughout this code is we want to enable more things that don't have to be done through PUD, but to the extent you are doing a PUD, you could get a little more flexibility. But at least this open space section, both here and coming up in chapters 5 and 6, should give you better guidance on what types of spaces you're looking for, how they should be designed, how they integrate into the project, and then how much space you would use.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I'll jump quickly back up to street design. So that kind of covers, unless, well, I guess I'll pause there on open space. Does anyone else have any other questions? Because that's that third major bullet point there.
I have one that was sent in. Kate wasn't able to be with us, but she sent a list of questions or topics that she'd like to have discussed or brought up.
Okay.
In 16.3.3 street and block patterns, there's a notation that proposed street layouts shall extend and connect to existing or planned streets in the surrounding area unless the city determines it's undesirable or specific reasons of topography or design. And the question is, could this section be used to help create reconnections, address instances where development is proposed, but there is a closed dead-end street from a previous development? Examples were near Winslow Crane, on Bates, South Huron near the vet hospital, Radcliffe near Windermere. So I guess would it be able to reconnect streets that were previously there but were closed at one point for a development that's now going away?
Yes, that's good question. The answer is probably very nuanced on whether you would do that or not. Essentially, what we're trying to do with the connectivity standards back under the first bullet point of street design is carry over your existing ones. You have you're probably one of the most highly connected cities we've ever worked in. So it's the area that we think kind of needs the least attention from a standards standpoint. But what we're trying to do is basically reestablish your block structure. It's very regular, and those block dimensions as the default. In other words, you should connect at this level. If you aren't connecting at this level, why? And there's some good reasons not to. And a lot of the places you have disconnections are actually some of those good reasons. Like there might be a park, there might be a transition in the block structure related to a different development project. And so what those sections on connectivity are trying to do is then go, okay, if we're losing the public block structure, we need to have an internal structure at a block scale. So whether those are private access lanes through there, or whether they're public drives that deviate from the street standards, something that connects the project internally at the larger than block scale if you lost the block structure. And then with those are requirements to at least raise the question of, well, if we're not connecting the streets, do we need bike or pedestrian connections? And a lot of the examples I think that you just mentioned, at least one of them that I'm familiar with, actually does exactly that. It has a pedestrian passage through to connect to that street. So it's kind of a long-winded way of we're trying to make sure that when there is disconnection, it's for a good reason. And when there is disconnection, we're raising questions about connectivity at a different scale, both within the block or for pedestrians and bicycles. And so, yes, those same provisions could be used to reconnect should redevelopment happen as well. But I think there would probably be a lot of public street planning and policies that would impact whether you would reopen a street or not. I don't think the regulations themselves probably wouldn't answer that question on its own.
Okay, I've got more from Kate that I'll
Okay.
chime in with as we go.
I'll keep moving down the street sections. So the next level, and I'll get to some of the images and graphics here in a moment. We included all of the street standards, the current ones that are in there. Those are just sort of the generic right-of-way, pavement width, sidewalk width standards. So one of the reasons we do that is we don't want to assume that we have to answer the question for every single street type. And so keeping what you have is usually a starting point. However, we did add, we know the neighborhood streets, the mixed use streets, and the pedestrian streets. That was one of the things this committee discussed a lot, that within those right of way and street widths, there's a lot of design issues. And so we came up with some default street types that organize how those different streets should come together, or existing streets, and for the most part, could be redone. And so that leads to the last point of, in doing that, both you, this committee, and the technical committee said, we really need flexibility for existing conditions and constrained right away, because not everything is going to meet the default standards. So I'll move ahead for a moment. So this was the idea. The top is your, essentially what your existing street sections in the code right now will look like if we just drew them in 3 dimensions. So it truly is right away width, road width, and sidewalk width. Even the lane things that we threw in are us interpreting that. There's nothing in there that says that's how that space should be used. So the bottom is where we're talking a little bit more about how that space should be used, and more importantly, how it should be organized to coordinate where things should and shouldn't go. And so then this is what the table in this there looks like right now, and the red points to the ones that we added new. And so if you'll notice, most of the right-of-way widths and street widths are the same or very close to the current standards. The advantage is that there is some of these streets could transition over a block without huge differences and changes, or they could even transition without much construction activity if it's reallocating space. But essentially what we're saying is you've already platted all your rights of way and streets. So let's try to do the best within those provisions. And then on the last part, this section is meant to go, okay, when we have conflicts or competing priorities, or when we have a constrained right of way, what's our decision tree? And these are just guides on how different ways you could allocate that space. All of these will then need to coordinate with the landscape standards, because that's where all the provisions for street trees and trees along the frontage will be included in chapter 8.
And Christine has a question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that chart of the different widths of different types of streets. And this one caught my eye because I was trying to figure out why only a few of them would have a bike lane and some wouldn't. I understand that our existing streets, some of them are way too tiny for a bike lane. And that we're not going to redesign most of our existing streets. But given that, I feel so much safer if there's a bike lane compared to if there isn't a bike lane. So I would like to see more of these include a bike lane as a default. And as a side note, I saw a picture today of a bicycle rider, and he had a t-shirt that said, "We both wish I was in a bike lane right now," because he's going, 8 miles an hour and all the cars are backed up behind him. So that was a question / comment on this one.
Yes, and a good one too. So I'll go through our rationale. It's actually more based on this chart here of where we say there should and shouldn't be one. So the first one is that when is there not a bike lane, and why? And our answer to that is it's really the slow or low volume streets where a bike should travel in the lane, or at least could. And that's usually the neighborhood streets, where it doesn't really help or hurt to stripe a bike lane. Sometimes it may actually even hurt if it signals that the travel lanes are free to be higher speed areas anyway. One of the more unusual examples that you may not be thinking of is sort of like a Main Street situation where there's very slow traffic. So it might be so it's not just always a neighborhood or hyper local street where you don't need a lane. It might be something that's a very slow street due to other reasons, a 2-block area that's really pedestrian oriented and the bikes feel comfortable going down those streets. That's usually where we say NA. As you move up the chart, we're trying to say that you should have the bike lanes on all of these streets, mainly higher order, so collectors or arterials. And then the third part of your question, which is a good comment to look more closely at, if there's not one here when it is a higher speed or higher order street, that means we ran into a space constraint, and in our default standard, we prioritize particularly, it's usually parking over the bike. It's not that that's the right answer for that particular segment, and this table should help us balance that. But I think your overall comment that on this table you'd like to see more bike lanes is a valid one as well.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that. If there are any more where we could put a bike lane, I would love that. If they're ones that are just too fast, maybe the bicycle facility could say something like off-street bicycle path suggested, something like that, so that it's not completely ignored.
Yes, that's a good
And
point.
then pedestrian areas too, I see what you mean. And I think of a pedestrian area as like those couple blocks of Broadway that have a lot of restaurants and really slow cars. It's 25 going through there. But you can be a pedestrian and you can be a car, but there's absolutely no way to be a bicycle there, because the cars don't want you in their lane and the pedestrians don't want you on the sidewalk. So I think even in a pedestrian oriented place, it would still be nice to have a place for bicyclists to go. And then could you go up one more slide, go back one more slide to the one that had 4 pictures? Okay, so the bottom left, that's the one that bothers me partly because it has the Sharrow markings, which are just so horrible for bicycling, and some studies are showing now that they're actually worse for safety than if the city did nothing at all. And drivers just completely ignore them. So I wouldn't ideally have that in there as any sort of model that we would follow.
Yes, good point. And that graphic is actually one that I just copied over from our original presentation when I think you raised that same point.
Oh,
Good.
good.
So that's my fault for using the old graphic because we did eliminate that from the bicycle lane green level there. We did not include the Sharrow. We went right to the bike lane. Whether we have again, this is the guide that should tell us to talk about some of those trade-offs. The other thing I would say about your comment on Broadway as well, we would expect a lot of these more, I guess, block specific or route specific decisions to hopefully be guided by either the walk and wheel plan or some broader analysis of the bike network. So, and then this page here, this guide that we're in there, we're using to say, okay, let's point us to the right type of facility. And to your point, an off-street facility might be the right answer, or an alternate parallel route might be the right answer when you're running into a situation where all of the things that you want just didn't fit because of the competing priorities.
Okay, Andy has his hand up.
Yeah, this is the slide I had a question about. Generally 5 feet minimum sidewalk width. That works if it's unobstructed, but we have a lot of situations where potentially we could be doing something that does have a lot of obstructions in it. So it'd be nice if we could mention that 5 feet is minimum, but if there's obstructions in it, there should be efforts to make it wider.
Yes, good point. We'll make a note of that.
Does that kind of tie up into anyway, sidewalk and bike often get kind of sloughed together sometimes? It's the pedestrian biking kind of people side, but it's also, if you're fortifying a sidewalk or a bike with planting and stuff, there's a little bit more maneuverability there. And it really does become about those choke points, like where do you cross Dartmouth? Where do you cross Oxford? Where do you cross like north-south wise? And then you have the bigger barriers of a highway and east-west wise, and the light rail. And then anything more than 4 lanes is also complicating too, so the choke points, I think, and then this is me, I need to study my geography, but choke points, I guess. And also to Christine's comment, maybe we have consider getting into situations where you have I don't want to overcomplicate it, designate road types. If you go to that slide, where it has, collector road, but if you have collector road A, B, because like you said, not every collector road is going to be the same kind of standard, at least a standard collector. But what if, what is a non-standard collector? Well, a neighborhood connector, or alleys, maybe not appropriate for bikes, but, maybe what's the minimums, width we want, of a street that can have a bike, and then which ones are not appropriate, and if you want to designate subcategories and get into all that,
Yeah.
it gives you more fine-tuned control. It's administrative, though. It means more work for us if
Right.
we want it.
That brings up two good points. The first is one of the things we've talked about with regard to that specific plan that the city put on the books a little over a year ago, which was meant for area scale planning that can affect the code. And so one of the first things we're putting there in our working draft is a street network plan. So something that's larger than a block scale, and where you could go designate certain streets based on these criteria. So we could see this being leveraged in some of those plans to go do some of that specific analysis that you just mentioned and take these and refine from it. The other thing we would absolutely like, because again, we're coming from, well, you can see where we're coming from your code standpoint. It's the standard arterial, standard collector, standard local, commercial, industrial. Those are what you have from a regulation standpoint. And everyone knows that's not how all your streets were built and designed. They were built and designed with a whole bunch of other different priorities that went into it. So I think it would be fantastic if this table and then this guide suddenly became a way to go do a transportation plan or do one of those specific area plans, because you're right that there are some decisions that aren't appearing in here, but this could be pointing them in the right direction.
Christine?
Thanks. On the line under local, that's commercial industrial, I would love, especially if that one could include a bike lane, given that a lot of our industrial areas in Inglewood are slowly, gradually being converted over to multifamily, when we know that those are the households that will definitely need bike lanes. Like Mr. McBride was saying in his comments, since there might be less parking there, they might be near transit. So I think that would definitely be a place where we would want to have a bike lane as the default. And it does look like there is room for it with a default street width there, since they are a little wider than some other streets.
Yes, that's an excellent point as well. So this was kind of reflecting that, let's keep the existing. However, what you raised is a good point. What we probably ought to do is, with either Public Works or the technical committee, go back and add some of the detail from this table, from doing the exercise with this table, add some of the detail to those streets. Because what we didn't put anything in because we didn't know whether that was supposed to be a 4-lane commercial industrial, since it was 44 feet wide, or whether it's a 2-lane with all of the things you mentioned. So we can certainly do that with in the next iteration, I think.
Hey, Chris. Oh, I've got a couple of comments from Kate. So on that table, first one is there's no landscape amenity listed for standard arterials. Should there be?
Yes, that's a good point. It's very similar to Christine's last point is, yes, there probably should be. We should go ahead and take the liberty and go, okay, within this space, we think this is a doable amount of landscape amenity.
Okay. Also, there's a note, we still need shade trees on pedestrian streets. We might require more than a 5-foot urban amenity.
Yeah, okay. What we're reflecting there is, so the urban amenity, we're going to have graphics that detail these, the difference between the tree strip or whatever terminology. We have a note to get the terminology correct, which is sort of that longer landscape strip that's continuous. It is different from the urban amenity. The urban amenity is essentially signifying an expanded sidewalk, and the trees then are placed in tree wells. So we'll have a specification for what's a good distance for that. And actually in the landscape section that's coming in chapter 8, you'll start to see some of the priorities of where you should and shouldn't plant a tree. But the urban amenity one is saying there's a 5-foot area that's the extension of the sidewalk. So it reads to everyone as the sidewalk, but it starts to have some of those obstructions because it's just an overflow area, and it's where the street trees and street wells are. It's where benches, trash receptacles, those types of things are. But we think 5 feet is sufficient to get a large enough tree well in that condition.
Okay, and then I guess this last question probably ties into that. In some of those areas, consider adding an option to plant trees in curb zones where there's not enough room in the landscape amenity area. So it sounds like that kind of ties back in once we see those graphics.
Yes, exactly. I think the one thing we have not quite addressed in the code that your situation might be ripe for is the idea of where you take existing streets and maybe even bump out from the curb zone and put some of those landscape amenities in. We would have to probably, that's one that's more of a really specific capital design project. And perhaps something needs to be added to this table that adds that option. But I think there's certainly nothing to say that you can't take a segment of a block and go, well, we're now claiming some of the street space for the urban amenity zone on either like a bump out or an interim or some kind of intervening level. But we'll take a look at that. That's a good point. Any other questions on 3? Oh, the last point on bullet point I didn't mention, it's more of a engineering base, but we tried to then group all of the parts of subdivision regulations that are more process or construction oriented into this last one, that because again, a large part of the platting and subdividing process is to make sure that you're looking at the bigger picture in terms of utilities and infrastructure. And so all of the things that are in there are in your current code. We just tried to emphasize 2 things. One, the technical committee wanted more strength on at the development scale. We want to be able to require that there's a capacity analysis done. And then the second part kind of follows up with that. There might be options to, when an improvement being asked for is larger than the scale of a project, Can we partner and build that to the planned size and not just the size that's needed for that project? Again, you currently have both of those in your current code, and we're just trying to emphasize those.
Christine?
Okay, last thing for me on this, I think, can you go back to that table one last time?
Mhm.
Okay, so I wonder if sometimes if there's a street that can either accommodate parking or a bike lane, but not both, could you rearrange the table and put parking and bicycle facility columns right next to each other? And then you could essentially merge the two cells and say either parking or bicycle facility, something like that, so that we're not predetermining that parking will always be the default. Or you could say we're not predetermining that bike lanes will always be the default.
Yeah, I like that suggestion. That's a great suggestion.
So I will say that in some experience, I've heard that sidewalks are the first things that like some developers will try to get out of, and interconnectivity, especially when things try to get phased, or if you have a PUD or, and it's next to the next one, or either they're only responsible for so much, or, and then that's contingent on certain tenants coming in big boxes or something, and then one falls out. And then they don't want to like do sidewalks enter like, something supposed to be a town center walkable feeling turns into kind of just any kind of strip mall kind of type thing. Is there, maybe this is too process oriented back in a different chapter, but what's the neighborhood protection accountability type thing? It's an oversight, but is it a planning commission thing? Is it a city development, community development? What's the oversight for like seeing that project through and saying, you achieved those wickets, those of, actually getting that much the bikes that actually connected, or this street with this width, or the sidewalks this many trees and that type, and the visibility triangles and the plantings of the right, the square footage and stuff.
Yeah, I'll answer it from some of our other projects where we run into that most on a lot of the larger growth communities where there's a serious timing phasing issue associated with almost all projects. And so in those cases, the first part of your question is how we address it. It's a process one it's a path for under those required improvement sections of the subdivisions. What's the administrative process from approval of construction documents to permits to certificate of occupancy? That's usually where those hooks are in there to make sure all of what was required was done. And if it's a larger scale project, there might be different phasing considerations that are done, but you try to get your hooks into it that way. I'll defer to staff on the rest of the ones, because I think in most cases for you all, it happens in those larger scale PUDs, and or under the things we've just been discussing, it's going to be on a a street segment by street segment basis. And so I think those are already being addressed through a lot of the PUD reviews, but we can certainly try to strengthen that when we get to the PUD section.
I think you're good, Chris.
All right. So I'll move on now to parking. So one of the reasons this came to you all as part of this package was the idea that the access standards are sort of related to that access and connectivity issue we talked about with the streets, that idea of street network, then block scale connectivity, then internal block, and then the access to individual lots. So there is some coordination here that's done in chapter 6. Overall, we for the kind of clarify and improve the usability of the code, we expanded the intent statements based on the overall approach to making sure there's clear intent for all of these standards. There's currently just a small purpose statement. We tried to make it a little more robust on what we're trying to achieve with parking. And to the commenter, the citizen or comment earlier on, there are a lot of things in there that we're trying to do, but again, we're trying to figure out how far we push on the balance. So the intent statements ought to be our first threshold of, is that really what we're trying to achieve with parking? So there's a lot of multimodal, there's lots of reducing redundancies when it's not needed. And then a lot of the sustainability goals are listed with that on with regard to parking. And then other than that, we wanted to group the parking chapter under these 4 main topics. Well, 3, with the 4th one being the landscape that's coming in chapter 8. So with regard to access, I already mentioned coordinating with chapter 3. So there's that block connectivity and streetscape level connectivity. Those are mostly the things where we're talking about connections to the bike network, connections to the transit systems that your project may not be providing that, but you might be near that. So how are you building off of that, that context you're in? There's another example of one of those context-based standards. So we tried to marry all of those over and really make them coordinate a little better, but mostly everything in that section, that access and circulation 16.7.3 is your current standards just recharacterized under this code structure. There are greater limits with regard to alleys. We're trying to take a stronger statement with, if you have alley access, you really shouldn't be having curb cuts at all. And so that's in there. That's a change from what's going on now. And then the last one is coordinating this with frontage types, which is a design technique that we're going to use for the private property on chapter 5 with regard to neighborhoods and housing, and chapter 6 regarding the commercial and non-residential site design. So those will begin to link at that point on access. Any questions on the access provisions?
Andy?
What would justify having additional access beyond the alley? It says just justified by a traffic study, but is this more engineering and dimensions and the type of vehicles, or is it like the amount of traffic they're anticipating?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know that I have a good answer. What we did there was we tried to flip a current provision on its head, so to speak. And so that with a traffic study was borrowed from something that's currently in the code. So I think we wanted to intentionally keep it a little bit flexible as to what might justify it, mainly because we're taking a much stronger stance that you can't have access at all if you have an alley. Right now it's listed as, I think it's over 4 units, a residential property over 4 units gets a certain amount of driveways, or at least opens it up from non-alley access to driveways. I might have that slightly wrong. So Brooke or Brian, correct me if I'm wrong. But essentially we tried to your original question, we tried to keep that traffic study a little vague to be open to a number of conditions where it could be all of what you mentioned, maybe size of vehicles, volume, something that the project's of a scale where the alleys just aren't going to be sufficient.
Thanks.
Christine?
Thanks. I had some questions on the bicycle access part, but I didn't know if you have other slides on that, or is this the only slide here?
This is the only slide here. Yeah, this one.
Okay. I noticed in the draft about bicycle parking design standards. And I'm really glad those are in there. And I wanted to see if we could add a default design of the inverted U bike parking, because I have found that people who don't ride a bike have no idea how sucky some of their bike parking is. And I was also a little conflicted in the next part that says that you can design them to be artsy and character. And I kind of like the creativity and flexibility there. But then I'm also worried that they will turn into one of those that are artistic and decorative, but are really unfunctional for bicycles. And I've seen a number of those in Inglewood that I'd like to avoid. So it seems reasonable to at least put in the inverted U as the default. And then I would leave it open to you guys in the group as far as how much flexibility to add for design and artsiness.
Yeah, I think I don't disagree with you at all. And I think we have a note even to ourselves to run down if there's someone on city staff that already has command of this issue. But I agree with you completely on the inverted U. The other thing I think is included in one of our internal notes that, you know, again, this is a working draft, but you're right to hone in on that section. We found if there's a manual, a lot of times there's things with regard to bike parking design specifically that we couldn't even put in a code because it's so nuanced. So if there's a good manual that either is, you know, Denver Metro specific, or perhaps even, I know there's, I can't remember I think it's the Bike Ped Association. There's a national association that has a really good manual as well. And so it might be something as simple to say, it's the inverted U, it's this guide, and anything else, you know, needs a more thorough review. I guess the other part about why we put in the other elements, it's more of the practical side of it as well. Like I think there's a lot of things like, it may not be what you're shooting for, and I might be opening up a can of worms here by even suggesting this, but when you go walk down an area that's highly bikeable, people lock their bikes to a lot of different things. Some things work even though they weren't designed for it, and others don't. But there was at least that idea of, we wanted, if things could serve as the bike parking, we wanted to perhaps count them if there was difficulty in fitting in a specific bike parking area. I might have touched on a sore subject among the biking population, but it's more of an observation of ours.
I don't see any other hands.
Okay. I'll move down to the parking quantity. This is squarely in the comment that was at the beginning of the meeting. We did start with keeping the current rates as the default. There are some that maybe are a little bit high. We are starting to take a look at the residential parking rates, but we're also aware of issues where high density residential is maybe having some overflow parking issues. So I think, and then also the Denver study that was mentioned is very instructive. So this is one of those areas where, at least when we last left off with the steering committee, it was, we want to be context based, we want to be flexible, and we want to push, but not push too far, because we know we're not getting to a car-free living environment yet. So that led us to say, well, let's start with keeping the current default standards, and then start to look at ways to whittle that parking down. So some of them are in your code now, and some we're suggesting to add new. So there's a complete exemption in the MUB1 along Broadway that's existing now, and so we're carrying that over. We're suggesting adding a credit for on-street parking. So anywhere, and we have it in there as you can look at this in all different ways, but we prefer to try to draw it at the largest scale and then give you a lesser credit. In other words, so we're counting parking within 300 feet of your lot on street. Every one of those you can count for a half a space. And the idea is that everyone within that area is sort of sharing that space as a public amenity. Whether that formula is right or not is, it's sort of arbitrary, but some things with parking are, well, many things with parking are arbitrary. You don't kind of know the right answer until you look at a site specific or project specific solution. Transit areas, we wanted a 20% reduction right off the bat. So these are things that wouldn't have to go through the alternative parking plan. A 20% reduction if you're within a quarter mile of a transit station, or if you're within 650 feet of a transit stop. And then a walk bike credit of 15%, a 15% reduction if you can prove you're in a walkable area or bikeable area, and your patronage is going to be likely to ride bikes or walk, a 15% credit. And then just a blanket 10% administrative adjustment that would be that staff could give for certain situations, adaptive reuse of a site. The site's constrained and it's tough to find that last 10% of parking, so staff could use their judgment. Among all of those, there's obviously a cap. You can't layer them all to get so far down, but we felt that whittled down pretty substantially on some of the parking issues based on particular context. And if any particular context had a parking problem, then staff would look at those reductions in a little more critical eye. The second thing we did was we did add what we call soft maximums. So there's not a maximum per se, but and this might be, I don't know, we've talked about it at the staff level of how often are you really designing and building really large scale uses with massive parking lots. Not that often. The ones you have are probably the more recent ones are probably, you may not see those again anytime soon unless there's large scale redevelopment. However, some of these could kick in on smaller sites as well. And the idea is if you're going over 120% of what's required, you need to do some type of mitigating strategy. So among those were designing the area to have more porous pavement or treat stormwater more strategically to get at some of those sustainability goals, increasing the landscape coverage required by parking by 10% larger area and 20% more plant material. So to get at that tree canopy heat island effect, offering up the extra parking for shared parking on the block. So in other words, if you're building the overflow, you need to make the overflow available to someone else. So there's some of those things that whittle down or at least cause people to think more before they would provide well over the requirement. And then there's anything over 140% of the requirement needs to prove that they need it. So a transportation or parking study would need to justify that particular use actually needed 140% of what's required. And then the last provision is we did put EV parking requirement in that depending on the context and the use.
Sorry to interrupt, but could I
Yep.
ask a quick question?
Sure.
Well, or make a comment?
Mhm.
On the, and this is in line with a lot of the multifamily that's going in light industrial right now. I don't know if this is something that we can put in here or how we address it, but if they're going to reduce the parking because they're within a quarter mile or even a mile of a light rail station, these light industrial areas have zero sidewalk. They are not pedestrian friendly. So I don't know how we address that. If you're going to reduce your parking requirements, then there must be some coordination with Public Works or something that says you can do that because we know that it's safe for pedestrians. But if it's not currently safe for pedestrians, something has to be done. I mean, because, I drive down past all the new, down to Oxford, past all the new stuff. And it is terrifying for anybody who has to walk right now because they're parking on the streets there, which, the businesses don't necessarily care. And I don't care if they're parking on the streets, but I do care when they're trying to run across. And I mean, it's just very, very unsafe. So that's going to continue to be an issue the more that we see, because I know of 2 PUDs coming in that same area. But if we're going to talk about reducing parking, then something has to be done with pedestrian and bicycle safety because it's a nightmare. So if you want people out of their cars, you have to make it safe for them to be out of their cars. So I don't know how we detail that, but I'd like to have that as part of some sort of discussion or prompt.
That's an excellent point. I think I can see a very clear and easy way if we haven't done it already in that transit credit. The distance ought to be measured on safe, accessible pedestrian routes. That's an easy one to then staff can evaluate that. And if it's not there, either you don't get the credit or you need to put it in. So those are things that are, again, those are objective and measurable. It's not a vague scenario. So we can make sure those distances from those stops or station areas are measured along pedestrian paths and routes.
Christine?
I wanted to second what Judy said. That was very well said. I agree totally, and I'd like to add bicycles to that conversation too.
Good. Moving on the quantity, we did have a requirement for some uses on EV, and we're aware of different committees talking about this and different, and the council even considering this. So we're monitoring those discussions to see whether this provision remains, whether it should be softer, stronger. But the 5 to 15% is comparable to other codes we've reviewed that have this requirement. And the one thing we're also looking at is, should the code be parking designs that are EV ready versus parking that's EV supplied? And the difference there, as we understand it, is there's a lot of underground and utility access that needs to be thought about with regard to EV stations and how the parking lot's laid out. And a lot of times, if you don't get that in, it could be more complicated to retrofit it, I guess, later. Not always, but at least we've seen that distinction in codes that they'll give some credit where, if there's at least the facilities to put it in at some point are made available. And again, it's one of those ones where we have several different code versions and we're looking at, and so, you know, we're happy to accept comments, suggestions, but we're also aware of the parallel discussions going on outside of our code project that we need to monitor as well.
Christine?
Thanks. I have some strong opinions on this, as you can imagine, and thanks for including it here. I think I originally did advocate for it to be in the UDC as opposed to the building code for a number of reasons, but the world of EV ready parking has changed so rapidly, I think, since we talked about it last, and we now have the state law that says that whenever we update our building codes next, we have to include the latest energy code, and that has to include EV ready parking for all adoptions after July 1st. And so I think that kind of moves the discussion back to that it should probably be in the building code, not in the UDC. And I'm fine with that as long as it goes somewhere. And so I might advocate for taking it out of here against what I said previously, but like I said, things have changed. If we did that, I would also suggest that we include in the materials to City Council about why we took it out, that we had considered it, but that we have this new state law that puts it into the energy code.
Yeah, and one of the things I think we'll want to monitor, I think either way, I think there needs to be something in here. So the ones we've seen where it defers to building code, a lot of times that's some of the smaller scale residential where the EV readiness is truly embedded in the building itself. And I think that's slightly different from commercial uses where it's a larger parking lot where it's more publicly accessible or it's out as part of the site design. Those might be two different things. And at least this code would need to be, if not requiring it, coordinating with the building code and saying, you know, these are acceptable accessory structures in a parking lot at the very least.
Christine and then Bernie.
Yeah, good idea. And then I also wanted to mention that it seems like the latest iteration of EV ready building codes distinguishes by type of commercial building and multifamily building. And they say that multifamily needs more than commercial, and so some things like offices need more than certain other types of commercial warehouses or something where you're just stopping in. And so that seems like the latest and greatest something to look at as types of buildings within the commercial and multifamily sector.
Bernie?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I think having any sort of requirements that defer back to the building code in a development code or in a zoning code is a good idea. And the reason for that is that as somebody who delves into these things every day, every municipality is sometimes on different requirements. So even if it sort of references something that's going to be changing every 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, I think it's good to have it within the context of the development code, even if it is defaulting back to the building code, The other comment I'd like to say is, and I agree with all of what everybody's saying regarding whether it's, walkability, bikeability. And I know the city has an overall, plan in place to kind of look at the existing context. It would be great if that plan could be done and in place and sort of trying to get ahead of what the trends are with where development is happening and where the need for pedestrian improvements and bike improvements are. Because if not, it becomes an absolute nightmare for the individual developers to coordinate all of that. If it's a large scale project, that's one thing. If it's an infill project, it becomes very hard. One recent example of this that I was part of was when, you saw all of this redevelopment in North Denver along Brighton Boulevard and what's now called Rhino. And, the Brighton Boulevard redevelopment plan, which was overtaken by the city and overseen by the city, was put in place to try to address all of that, to deal with the existing development that was there and also trying to get ahead of future development. So I'm not 100% caught up as to what the city's activities are, but I think whatever standards are developed here, if they could be grouped with a game plan from a citywide perspective, I think it would be helpful, not only for the developers, but also just for citizens to understand what the future, what is this actually going to look like? If we're going to put a bike lane for 2 blocks, well, okay, it's a bike lane for 2 blocks, and then you hit, a major street and you can't get across it. So I know that it's probably redundant, but I just wanted to make that comment.
Ryan?
Yeah, I wanted to tag on. I'll make it even more redundant because no, I think it's a good thing to point out because the point kind of is redundancy. You nailed it on the head when you said a self-referential code is usually a good thing, and many times it's a good thing. You always hate it when you're trying to find the one instance of the use of a certain term or a certain thing. But the way I think of this is maybe that the building code tells you how to do it. The universal planning code or the planning code is why you do it and when you do it and where you do it, like where is it appropriate, what proportion, and then if there's ministerial or administrative power of requiring it or not requiring it. So I think we're on the right track when we see it broken out this way. But I'd love this public nailing it on the head that you're thinking about it the right way.
All right, the next topic on parking design, pretty simply what we tried to do is there's currently a lot of things in there about, and by parking design here, we're talking about the where and how it's laid out, landscape amenities, islands, how much, and all that kind of stuff. So what we tried to do was simplify it and essentially make the standards based on the larger your lot, the more of that you'll have to do. And also then prioritizing that the closer your lot is to the streetscape, the more you'll have to do. So in other words, a preference towards smaller scale lots that are broken up and a preference for lots that don't front on the streetscape, or to the extent they do, it's better for them to be smaller. So that's just the general layout of the parking lots themselves. And so we tried to simplify it, knowing that you have a lot of tight and small infill sites. The second thing is coordinating with Chapter 8, which is, okay, that's laying out the landscape areas, what goes in them, what's the landscape requirement. So what we're trying to do in Chapter 8, and again, by way of a preview, we didn't quite lump it in with this batch, but it's very related in that it's coming in the next batch. We took a similar strategy with landscape. We want to simplify what's required so it's easier to get to your count. So what you'll see is there's a per parking space and per perimeter landscape requirement. And then then gives the person, the site designer, I know I need to lay my site out this way, and I know I have to have this many plants. They can then begin to allocate them based on some guiding priorities that we have in there. It's not that, every parking space needs a tree within 5 spaces. There's not that kind of aspect to it, but we do think there's a good balance between having the performance standards, screening the parking, creating more infiltration through trees and tree canopies, minimizing the heat island by a larger tree canopy. But those are all things that are highly specific to each site on where trees should go and how much coverage you would get. So we're trying to strike a balance on that parking design of, you know, get to the requirement a little bit easier, let designers kind of lay it out based on what they're trying to achieve, as long as it's meeting the public goals. I'll hit the last two real quick, and then we can maybe circle back to any questions on the parking design. With regard to flexibility, there are provisions for administrative adjustments in this section, and all of those sections where we add a few more criteria as to when you would deviate from the standards, again, based on the design objectives of each section. And then there's the current provision on alternative parking plans. The technical committee talked a lot about that and had some issues or problems with it. So we're kind of waiting on that right now to see how much some of these other flexible provisions can accomplish, how much could be accomplished through the administrative adjustments, and then recalling that some of these instances may be PUDs where they're kind of doing a plan anyway, and could the parking plan be lumped into there? And so is that section even needed is kind of our question. If we've done enough in these other areas, maybe that section doesn't need to be in there, but we're monitoring that. So I'll open it up to any questions you might have on all of the parking issues.
I don't see anybody else, but I have a couple from Kate. More comments and questions. The first one is comment, parking minimums still seem high, but the parking reduction section is appreciated. And then we might consider a percentage shade requirement for parking landscape requirements. Example, require all new parking lots to have 40% shade requirement, shade coverage within 15 years of construction. All trees planted in these parking lots should also be required to have a minimum of 500 cubic feet of soil in order to achieve their potential size and meet shade requirements. It goes on, tax incentives for surpassing minimum shade requirements are also suggested, as well as enforcement during planning, construction, and years after the installation.
Yeah, on the last couple, one of the things, so there's a section in the landscape section on specifications. It doesn't go quite as far as to say that the cubic feet of soil per tree, but that is a very good and valid standard. What we're used to seeing is not necessarily codifying that in a, it's sort of like what we were just talking about the building code. That's sort of the building code for landscape. You know, that's the details of, someone has to go out and inspect that, and you can show it on plans all day long, but if someone doesn't put it in right, those plants aren't going to survive. So our note internally is the city has a current landscape specification guide. How well is it working? Does it need to be updated in coordination with this? And how much of some of those really detailed, back to the point even of the street trees and the urban amenity of 5 feet. We have some suggestions that trees shouldn't go in a tree well that's over a certain size, because we see that on a site plan and a plan view, and it's easy to measure. The real answer is, well, it can go in a much smaller one if it has access to that much cubic feet of soil somewhere else. So those are some of the things we kind of prefer to leave to like construction specifications or details, but there's all certainly really good points. The canopy one, I think that might be another one. Again, it's tough to codify. I think we have some of that in our performance goals, which will come in the landscape standards, and some of that's actually in the design objectives of the parking and the intent as well. But again, it's a matter of how we measure it and versus does it become a codified standard or a goal on how you lay out your landscape generally. But it's a valid point. And then circling back to, we did start on the parking rates themselves. We are starting with the current ones, but we're open to looking at places where maybe they could and should come down a little bit, or adding more options for when they could and should come down. Kind of going full circle back to the public comment at the beginning, we're yet to roll in some of the housing issues and then also the affordable housing component. Those discussions have hit on the point of parking being a driver to affordability. So I would expect that if not in the code itself, as part of the housing policies, might be a waiver of some parking in exchange for affordability, at least as a first step. That may not hit all of the price points and targets you're wanting to build of housing, but at least there is some thinking along those lines as well going on.
Andy?
Yeah, you're touching on what I was going to comment on. Like, when is it an appropriate time for us to circle back to this amount conversation? It sounds like there still need to be some more technical committee discussions, but the residential side, it sounds like there's additional work coming, but is it the right time to start talking about taking some of these commercial rates down?
Yeah, I think yes to all of them, even on the residential, because that is one of the ones we flagged of, is that the right strategy for multifamily or different formats of housing generally? I think the circle back part is we are pretty confident that there's going to be some additional reductions in exchange for affordability. Again, I don't know whether it will live in the code or it will live in an affordable housing policy, but that comment has kind of come through all of the discussions. But other than that, I think that table and the rates are open for debate right now.
Yeah, we've as a state, we have a new greenhouse gas rule that our Transportation Commission adopted that is asking us to do some mitigation actions related to GHG that are tying into things like parking requirements and having a lower max and getting rid of minimums in a lot of cases. I don't know if that's every inch of Inglewood, but it seems like there's a lot of momentum behind that, and considering that, I wouldn't necessarily think some of the issues that we're having on a block level of overflow parking and other things where people are taking advantage of the street parking that is there, and some of it has been historically used for people who show up to work at maybe a contractor site there and then drive off to other sites. I don't know if those are really, we hear a lot about those, but I drive through some of those or walk through some of those a lot, and I think they could be mitigated in other ways, and we are really restricting the feasibility of a lot of potential unit production if we just listen only to folks who really want to see the maximum amount of parking added to some of these new projects, just because it makes it harder to pencil for the number of units, or even smaller units that could be more affordable. You have people instead choosing to build bigger units and try and hit that higher market because maybe, the parking, they can add more parking and not have that overflow problem. So I just think we should have a longer discussion about that.
I don't see any other hands, Chris.
Okay. And again, I think on all of these topics, we are trying to get towards what we think is a recommended draft by the winter, hopefully by December. So we may not answer everything by then, and maybe there's further things to push on, but not only the parking rate, but I think all of these things are not necessarily set in stone at this point. So if you have further comments as you think or re-review, or particularly as you see some of the other puzzle pieces of this come in, don't forget to come back and revisit these as well for your thoughts, because it may change how you're viewing one or more of these standards, and think maybe we need to push further on things too. So just by way of winding up, the next steps would be on the 18th, the meeting would be regarding sustainability and general commercial design standards. So that's 6, 8, and perhaps 10. Right now, that's the floodplain regulations. We have a working draft going internally. We're not anticipating changing that We're not floodplain experts. We kind of listen to what problems you might have and then try to restructure the code. We might be making some minor tweaks to make it fit the format of this code a little bit better. But Public Works is also reviewing it for any quick fixes they want to get rolled in. So that's the one we're waiting on. But other than that, 6 and 8 are ready to go, I believe, and you should be seeing those shortly for our meeting on the 18th. And with that, I'll just, if there's any other discussion points, I'd be happy to hear it, but I appreciate everyone's time tonight and thanks for the great comments.
Great work, Chris, and your team. I'm just so impressed as always, and it's so great to actually see the language. I know you've been working on it steady, but I think this was our first chance to see the actual words on paper, and it's just so exciting.
Yeah, I think it looks lovely. Text and graphics. I have to say, some of the sidewalk use kind of designation graphic was really elegant. So applause to your graphic design and all that. And another side note on, you were talking about bulbs and tree. Is there a local arboretum or local kind of agricultural facility in one of the colleges or something like that that maybe has guidelines and guidance for the local trees and shrubs that their what do you call it, kind of their adolescent phase in size and then their mature phase in size. So it's as guidelines. Maybe you don't necessarily tie requirements to it, but if you have to do tree inspections or something like that, and you want to acquire this thing or that thing, and it really is that kind of lot specific kind of measurement, is that good stuff, something good to have, or do you want to incorporate that as a reference?
Yeah, there's so in what we'll often do is have an interpretation section that can say you can use industry resources, industry guides, and maybe have an appendix of what those are. To your specific one, that what I'm most familiar with in the Front Range is the CSU extension seems to be the go-to source on that. Colorado State, they have an excellent list that we've incorporated into codes as well that deal with not only species sizes and those types of things, but I think goes even further into some of the specifications and survivability.
Thanks. That's a teaching moment for me. Thank you.
It could be good if we haven't already to run this by Inglewood's new urban forester guy, Evan, somebody, I think.
Brenda?
I was just going to say, we did hire a new forester, and part of the existing code, I think, disallows certain kind of trees according to the CSU plant guide. But yeah, I do think that we had a big die-off because of drought. I don't know if you've been to Cushing Park or along the street there that borders Cushing Park. We lost a lot of trees. So hopefully he does have a say in a lot of in that kind of thing.
They will, once we get the landscape amenity kind of spec standards that Chris had mentioned earlier, we'll work through parks. Evan is part of the parks department, so we'll coordinate with them. Like all this, it's not just the planning department looking at these requirements. We have multiple departments across the city going through these to make sure that they're not going to say anything conflicting to what they do, or to make sure that we're doing something that's doable. All right, I don't see any other hands up. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Well done.
Thank
Take care,
you.
y'all. Good night.
Good night.